Hey guys, and welcome to another episode on Meaningful Mystic / my channel / sorry, I didn't know what to say there for a second. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're actually going to talk about one of my favorite short stories. It is pretty well known within the occult because of the author. So today we are going to be talking about the House in the Brain. It's sometimes referred to as The Haunted and the Haunters. It is an amazing, very, very short story. It's maybe like a 20 to 30 minute read, or maybe like an hour, depending on how long or how quickly you read. So today we're going to be talking about, just like I said, The Haunted and the Haunters. So get your crystals, get your holy water. I don't think you're actually going to need it because you're hearing my synopsis of it, and I hope you guys can tolerate my synopsis because I'm going to tell you the synopsis of this the way I would tell somebody about the book, right? So background, the book is, the short story I should say, because it's not a full book. I think maybe back then, because it was written in 1718 and it's supposed to take place in the 1700s. But it was written by an author named Sir Edward Buller Lytton. It's not actually Bueller, it's just the way I'm pronouncing the name because I can't pronounce names ever. But some interesting information about Sir Lytton. I'm just gonna give his names that way. He's not only is he knighted, but he actually served under one of the queens in England as Secretary of State for 1 year. He's also known to be the person who created the phrase, "It was a dark and stormy night." Now, I understand that phrase, "it was a dark and stormy night," generally is cheesy and it's generally synonymous with scary movies, my mental state, scary books, and things of that nature. But because it's become so widely used within scary books and scary movies and setting the pace of it, it's given this idea that he is an unimaginative author, which is far from the case. Sir Lytton is a phenomenal author. I will say this is a great, great short story if you kind of slowly want to dip your foot into occult literature and things about occult literature. It also kind of like placates to the fact that like he is a guy who likes to write with less and letting your imagination kind of do the rest. And you'll see this throughout this story because he doesn't even give his narrator a full name. A lot of these characters only go by initials, which I think is also really, really interesting. But that's definitely a piece of it. Also, he was so prolific within occult writing that H.P. Lovecraft, who is like allegedly the king of horror, right? Or whatever people like to refer to as H.P. Lovecraft, he was a mega stan of this guy. And through H.P. Lovecraft, you see pieces of Lytton's writing, Sir Lytton, I should say, I'm sorry. He was knighted by the queen that he worked under because he was Secretary of State for a year, so let me put some respect on this man's name, Sir Lytton. So H.P. Lovecraft was a huge fan of him. If anybody would like to read this, and the reason why I also chose this is because this story is actually in the public domain. And if you're wondering what that actually means is, you can download it and read it for free. There's a large number of books that are downloadable and able to read for free online. There's also apps that you can pay $1 and that you can get unlimited audiobooks that are the books that are within the public domain. Same thing with the books that are within the public domain. So books like Art of War is now in the public domain, so you can get a digital copy of it. Different Sherlock Holmes books are within the public domain, etc., etc. So I'm going to say right now, spoiler, and I'm reading through my notes also to just make sure I cover everything because it's such a short story, but it's also very, very dense. So point blank, the whole story is about the narrator staying overnight in a haunted house. Now, I understand that kind of sounds like a cheesy premise. I get it. Like, there's so many movies now where people are like, I'm gonna go to a haunted house and I'm gonna be scared, blah, 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 blah. This is the case in this particular scenario, but like not really. So the narrator, who Sir Lytton doesn't give a full name to, so I'm gonna refer to him as the narrator, has friends over for dinner. It's his friend and the friend's wife. And the friend is like, yo, buddy, I 6 weeks ago stayed at this cottage or house. I can't remember if we refer to it as a cottage or a house, but it gives you the illusion that it's kind of like a mansion when the narrator's actually in it. So the friend's like, oh, 6 weeks ago. Okay, let me backtrack. So the friend is like, yo, I stayed in this place 6 weeks ago and it was haunted. And I know you're not going to believe me, and I have no desire to be ridiculed by you, but I'm telling you about this because I think you'd be into it. So then the narrator's like, okay, well, what experiences did you have? Like, tell me about the experiences. And he's like, bro, I'm not telling you what happened. He's like, but I'll tell you about the caretaker. And the caretaker was like, I'm going to die in this house, and the ghosts are finally going to have me. Cool, right? Cool. So the narrator, that freaks me out personally. Like, why would you tell your friend that you stayed at a haunted house and then know that your friend is going to be like super excited to go there? Anyway, so the narrator is like super excited about it. He's like, I gotta go to this haunted house. Give me the details. Like, yo, let me know where it is because I'm about to roll up and show you that you're crazy. Because we find out that the narrator does this for a living. He goes to haunted houses. This is his thing. He likes to debunk haunted houses. He's also someone who studies the occult with very famous occultists, and he's a student of it. So we can safely say that he's a student of the occult, and this is his thing, is debunking haunted houses. So don't get me wrong, I thought in the beginning that he was being set up by the friend, but when you find out a little bit further on, you realize he's not actually being set up. The friend is like actually doing him a solid. So whatever, I digress. So he gets the information from the friend that he has over for dinner. He's like, let me know where this house is. The next day, the narrator goes to the house and he sees that it's boarded up. The windows are boarded up, all this stuff. Can't get in, nothing. There's no sign saying like, oh, vacancy, whatever it is. There's nothing there. So as the narrator's leaving, there's this kid who's like, hey, mister, are you looking for someone? And the narrator is like, oh, I was hoping to like rent a room maybe. I had a friend stay here a few weeks back, and you know, he said he had an experience here, and I want to stay here also. And the kid's like, what are you talking about? He's like, this place has been boarded up for a few weeks now. He's like, they actually found the caretaker dead with her eyes open in her bedroom. And then the narrator's like, oh, okay, well, why don't you tell me who owns this place? And the kid is like, oh, well, Mr. J owns it, and he lives over on G Street, which are my initials, by the way. So he lives over on G Street. He's like, but mister, let me tell you, this place is haunted. Like, you don't want to stay here. The owner, Mr. J, can't even get people to open the windows or close the windows for him because it's so haunted. And like, not for nothing, I don't know at what point people started telling their kids not to talk to strangers, but like, I think it's really convenient that this kid not only knew, well, maybe because it's such a haunted house, that like everybody in the neighborhood knows that this is a haunted house. So like everybody knows that Mr. J owns it and where Mr. J actually lives. But like, why are you snitching on your neighbor, right? And like, why are you talking to strangers? Anyway, so the narrator then goes to Mr. J's house, right? And he tells him, he like introduces himself, and then there's like this whole scene where like Mr. J is like this older man, but he's like super friendly and like super cordial, and they make it a point to like make it seem like that he's like very, like he has his wherewithal and that he's like really, really nice, and he's like a cool like older man, right? So the narrator's like, hey, I want to rent a room in your house. Tell me, I'll pay you whatever you want for it, because apparently the narrator has some money. And Mr. J says to him, well, I came into owning this house because I had an uncle that died while I was away at war. And I had the caretaker rent the house. She was like, she used to live there, and I like saved her from a poorhouse or something. And she would stay in the house. In the past like 30 to 40 years, she's been like renting rooms there for me because no one wants to stay in the house longer than 5 days. He goes, if you can figure out what's going on in the house, you know, you can stay there for free. All I want you to do is figure out what's going on in the house. And we'll go from there. So that's basically the gist of the conversation. So that the narrator has with Mr. J. So then the narrator comes home to his boyfriend. I'm convinced it's his boyfriend. They allude that he's like a servant, but there's no way that this is a servant. This is his boyfriend. Like, I can tell you without a doubt that this is the narrator's boyfriend. He's referred to as Mr. F. Now, F probably for boy, F boy, F boy. And the reason why I'm referring to the narrator's boyfriend this way is because of what he does later on. He basically abandons the narrator in this haunted house. But anyway, I don't want to get too far ahead of it. So the narrator is home and he's like talking to Mr. F, which is his boyfriend, even though they say he's the servant. And he's like, hey, listen, I got these keys to this haunted house. Do you want to go on another adventure with me? I know we've done this all around the world and you've always been there for me. And, you know, we can go do this together and I feel so safe with you and blah, 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 you know, whatever it is. I think I made up part of that because I'm convinced that they're actually dating and they're lovers. So the narrator tells, you know, hey, you know, let's have another adventure. Are you down to have another adventure with me? And Mr. F's like, yeah, I'm totally down. Boo, I love you. Like, I'll do anything with you. Like, whatever. So then the narrator gives Mr. F the keys to the house. And he's like, I need you to go start a fire, cook me some food, change the sheets, dust the furniture, and bring my dog with you or whatever it is, right? And Mr. F's like, cool, I got you, boo. Like, let's do it. We're gonna go to the house and we're gonna have a great time. I'm gonna make sure I make the house for you. So then the narrator is like walking around London and he's just kind of like thinking about the night and like whatever it is. And he's like not really thinking anything. He's just trying to kind of like clear his mind. So then we get to, whoops, as I knock stuff over. So then we get to, I'm gonna break everything, yeah. Maybe this story doesn't wanna be told. Theme song. Anyway, so the narrator's like walking around London, clearing his like mind or whatever, and he ends up getting to this house like much later on in the night. Maybe it's like, I think they say it's like 3 hours past, and that's when he finally gets to the house. So then when he gets there, he's greeted at the door by Mr. F, which is his man, right? And he has like a bathrobe for him because like when honey comes home, you gotta have a bathrobe and a martini, right? And F is saying, you know, and the narrator's like, oh, did you have any weird experiences here while you were alone? And F was like, oh, nothing really. He's like, I felt like I kept hearing footsteps behind me, but it wasn't really anything. Like it was just kind of like a weird, you know, like footsteps. He's like, I don't really know this house. And I'm like opening the windows and like flipping the sheets and like cooking dinner for you. Like, you know, I don't really think it's anything. I think it might've just been my mind. So the narrator's like, okay, you know, like whatever. So they start walking around the house and the narrator is like, oh, why don't we sleep in separate rooms tonight? And this is the reason why I kind of think that they're lovers, because he's like, let's sleep in separate rooms tonight. Right? So that gives me the impression that they're always sleeping in the same room together all the time, which is kind of what I think. So he's like, let's sleep in separate rooms tonight. That way we can like get ahead of hearing things. Maybe you'll hear something in this room and I'll hear something in this room, you know, whatever it is. Spoiler, they hear nothing. When things start going down, they hear nothing separate from each other's rooms. So what ends up happening? So F and the narrator are like, they get to their room, he puts his stuff down, he puts his bathrobe on, right? And they start walking around the house. They're like, okay, let's start walking around the house and start locking the doors, because if somebody's in this house, we're gonna lock them in the room with us. Now, the narrator and F have been doing this for years. So they know the deal. Hey, we're gonna lock all these doors. Someone's in here, they're gonna be locked in this room. No one's gonna be able to get out. We're gonna be able to see what's going on. You know, no one's gonna get the jump on us, because that's the biggest thing for them. No one's gonna get the jump on us. So they lock all the doors and they get to this one room and they're like, yo, this room is like spooky. It's super cold in there. They find these like footprints on the floors around them. And then they go around them, like in front of this room, and then they go into the room because they're like, what is going on with this room? Like, it's super weird. There's footprints here. Like, clearly nobody else is here. F had his shoes on. Like, why is he walking around barefoot in a random mansion, you know? So they go in the room and they start finding these like letters, and then they get locked in the room. So they think somebody is like in the house. They get locked in the room and they get locked in. They find these letters and it's basically like letters that allude to this woman who we later find out is actually the caretaker because she used to live in the house. She used to live in the house. She was the rich person who lived in the house prior to Mr. J's uncle owning it. So she was the one who owned the house prior, right? Okay, so just that's an interesting piece of information that you guys need to know about. So there's these letters, right? And she's writing these letters to someone named Mr. Richards or Mr. DeVee, right? I can't remember who the letters were addressed to. But basically she's saying like, hey, you know, I'm haunted by what we did. People are gonna know what happened. Oh, you know, I'm not gonna be able to sleep, whatever it is. And then there's like, you find out later on that she believes her lover is like lost at sea. Mr. Richards is lost at sea. So eventually the door unlocks, and I guess because the ghost wanted them to see these letters that were like spooky AF. I really don't think these letters are spooky, but it alludes to the caretaker being a murderer almost. So they get on, the door unlocks and they like charge out of the room. They're like, yo, someone is here, let's roll up. They draw their guns, they're like, yo, we about to fight. And there's no one in the house because all the other doors are locked exactly the way they left them. So they find nothing and they end up going back to their room separately. They end up going back to their room separately. The narrator, I believe, is the one who says, oh, why don't we keep the doors open between us? Because there's something weird, something is a little bit weird that's going on right now. Why don't we keep the doors open that are between the rooms? That way, if you hear something in my room, you can come in, or if I hear something in your room, you can go in, AKA, like, they want to bang. But anyway, that's not the point of the story. I mean, it kind of is, because I just feel like, anyway, I don't want to digress. So we're led to believe that F starts having really horrific experiences because we see F in the same, within like minutes, right? And this is like an illusion of minutes, right? Or an illusion of like 20 minutes, I want to say, that goes by. And you see F like running into the narrator's room. He's like, don't worry. He's like, the ghosts are chasing me. I'm going to have them chase me out of the house. Da 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 da. Save yourself. We got to get out of this house, right? So then F shoots off and the narrator's like, yo, bro, what's going on? Like, this is crazy. The dog, because the dog is still there. The dog is going crazy. He's barking. He's like, dog, shut up, right? The narrator's like, shut up, dog, stop barking. So then F is completely out of the house at this point. And the narrator's like, okay, well, no one was behind you. I didn't hear anything. You know, maybe it was like him being like a little out of place or something, or like a little bit nervous about being in a new place. But he also acknowledges at some point, because we later find out the F is so spooked out that he leaves England. He literally leaves England and moves to Australia. So F, the narrator is saying like, hey, F isn't really like this. Like, he doesn't really get spooked out like this. But he's like, I'm going to try to figure out what's going on. So he basically starts this like inner monologue where he's like, okay, he's basically saying like, hey, I'm aware of how nature works and how we perceive nature, and we might not be able to understand how nature works, and that power and manifestation that can happen between people, electromagnetic pulses can create things and energies within houses. So he's basically saying like, okay, I know this stuff exists through the laws of nature. Trying to, I guess maybe it's like more of like, hey, I'm a man of science. I'm going to try to calm myself down a little bit. Which is why I think he says that out loud, but he's basically saying like, hey, someone is capable of manifesting this and they have the brain power to be able to manifest it. So then he goes and he like lays down, he like gets himself calm, he gets the dog calm, he lays down and he starts seeing a shadow manifest itself. And the narrator can't speak, he can't move, he can't do anything. And he's like, okay, wait. I'm feeling afraid, but is this actual fear, or am I afraid that something is going to happen to me? Like, he was just kind of like started questioning like, okay, am I actually afraid, or am I seeing something that's making me afraid? Like, that would make me afraid, if that makes sense. Like, and I think what the logic behind it is like, okay, I'm seeing something happening and this is something that is like actually scary, but am I actually afraid of this? No. Or is this someone creating something that's something that they believe that I would be afraid of it? So again, he like has this rationalization where he says this and he starts feeling weighed down by this spirit. He's like, oh my God, I feel like, you know, I'm being like pressed down by the spirit or whatever it is, but he can't move. He starts seeing like his pocket watch and his like knife come off the table, and he's like, you know what, I'm like not scared of this. It's clearly someone is playing a game with me, and you know, I'm seeing this apparition, but it's clearly somebody playing a game with me. And like, I know that this is what's happening. So the dog is freaking out, and once once the narrator fully convinces himself that someone is playing a game with him, the apparition stops. The movement stops, all of that stuff stops. And then it starts up again. And how it starts up is that it grabs his dog and kills it. Spoiler, I know, and I know that's really horrific. But again, the narrator says to himself, this is somebody else doing this. This is somebody creating this apparition, creating this energy that's manifesting this way. You know, I'm not afraid of this. This is something that they're trying to elicit fear from me, so I can feed into their energy of that. Which I think is really interesting, because for that time period to think about energies and things like that, I think that's actually really, really interesting. So he like looks at the moon and he's like, all right, I'm gonna breathe. He breathes and he goes back to sleep. He goes to sleep and he sleeps there completely overnight. He doesn't think anything of it. He wakes up. He wakes up the next day and he goes to see Mr. J, and he's like, and Mr. J's like, hey, what happened? Like, you stayed there overnight. You know, I thought you were going to be here in the middle of the night telling me that this place is haunted. And the narrator's like, well, listen, something is going on in this house, and I really think it has to do with this one room. We found a bunch of letters there, and we think it has to do with this room, right? He's like, I think you should tear the house down, and you should start from this room first, right? So then the caretaker listens to his advice, and the narrator's like, oh, I just want to make sure I'm a part of this project because I want to see what happens when we start like tearing this house down. So Mr. J, you know, agrees to it, and then like 10 weeks go by, and it turns out that Mr. J finds out more information about the caretaker, and apparently, get this, I wrote this down, so that the caretaker, she was married to some guy that the family didn't like, and it was, she was living there with another rich family member who mysteriously died, right? And they were all together, and that the family member had a son. And that son mysteriously died also, that the caretaker wasn't taking care of him. So that kind of plays into some of the letters that they found where she was like, oh my God, the ghosts are gonna get me. And it also plays to what the friend had that came over for dinner, what his experience was. Like, hey, the ghosts are finally gonna have me, you know, whatever, right? So 10 weeks go by, right, whatever. And they're starting to tear the house down, and when they start tearing the house down, they find a secret room inside of that room. And it's basically like a locked room. It's like a room under, like you lift a carpet, the way you would think of like lifting a carpet and there's like a latch or something. It was similar to that, right? And inside this separate room, which was kind of cave-like, they found pictures, they found dolls, they found clothes, they found, and then they found a safe. So they're looking at these pictures, right? And Mr. J goes to the narrator. He's like, hey, you know what? I feel like I've seen this guy before. He's like, I'm well-traveled, right? Because we find out that Mr. J is like well-traveled. And he's like, you know, I'm well-traveled. I feel like I've seen this guy before, but, you know, these pictures are from like the 1700s. There's no way, or like the 1400s or whatever it was. It was like 200 years prior. He's like, you know, I feel like I've seen this guy somewhere before. I don't really know. He's like, but that can't be real because the guy I know, his name is Devi, which is spelled D-E-V, which is kind of short for devil, but we won't talk about that till a little bit later. And he's like, you know, there's no way that this could be him because these pictures are so old. And there's no way that this is him, right? It has to be a different person. Maybe it's like an ancestor or something. So they get into the safe, and then they find they find a tablet in there, and they find like a cross and like all these like occult type things, right? And we later find out, or at least the experience that I have within the occult mythology, you find out that it's like a form of a sigil on an actual tablet that helps magnify Mr. Devi / Mr. Richards' powers to be able to manifest in that house. So the narrator also thinks to himself, you know what, I think I know this guy also, but he doesn't say anything to Mr. J about it because he's like, I don't want to get this guy like revved up. He's convinced that he's seen this guy before walking around London. So as they're like, you know, tearing this place down, they take some of the stuff out. They take some of the pictures out of this like cellar, this underground cellar, and the stuff that's like written in Latin on like the sigil that they have. And the narrator kind of like looks and he's like, yo, I think this is the guy. Like he thinks he sees the guy there, but he doesn't say anything to Mr. J because Mr. J is like this old man and he like doesn't want to scare him or something like that. So Mr. J obviously and the narrator are like mega friends, and the narrator starts then following this guy because he sees him and the guy sees that he sees him, and he starts following him. Right? And he somehow loses him. So then he goes back to Mr. J, and the narrator's like, you know, what do you know this guy's name under? Because the narrator just saw this dude. Like, oh my God, he just saw him. He's like, oh, well, I know him as Mr. Richard, but there's no way that this is the same person. This picture is too old. So whatever, right? So what ends up happening is the narrator sees Mr. Richards again. He sees him again. He's like around the house after it's been demolished, and he sees Mr. Richard / Mr. DeVee again. So he starts following him, and this time he's actually able to keep up with him, and he follows him into it's described like a speakeasy, but we'll refer to it as a bar. And he sees that this guy is like talking to other people, and you know, one of his friends coincidentally is there, and he asks his friend, he's like, hey, do you know who this person is? And the friend's like, oh, this is Mr. Richard. He's loaded, he's well traveled, everybody knows him, you know, whatever it is, everybody knows him. He's like the man about town. He's like a socialite in some way. So the narrator asks the friend, he's like, oh, can you introduce me to this guy? I want to talk to him. And the friend's like, well, I just want to like get my drink on. I want to keep drinking and having fun. And you know, he's not really the type of person to like have people talk to him like that. Or like he'll come talk to you. And he's like, no, introduce me to this dude. I want to meet this guy. So the friend introduces the narrator to Mr. Richards, and the friend at this point is like hammered drunk, and he's like, yo, I gotta go home. Like get my carriage. Like I gotta go home. So then the narrator is like, bro, I know who you are. And Mr. Richards / Mr. DeVee is like, I don't know what you're talking about. And the guy's like, no, I know who you are. I saw you outside the house. And he names where the house is. He's like, I saw you outside there while they were demolishing it. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, oh, and then throws the pictures at him. He's like, this isn't you. He's like, I found your stuff. And Mr. Richards is like, he's like, I still don't know what you're talking about. Like, stone cold calm. He's like, I still don't know what you're talking about. So then the narrator's like, bro, he's like, I know who you are. Whether or not you want to acknowledge who you are, I know exactly who you are. He goes, and I want you to know something. I study the occult, so whatever it is that you tell me, I'm going to believe you. He's like, but I just want to ask you questions. Like, I want to talk to you. I want to understand how your magic works or whatever it is, right? So Mr. Richards / Mr. DeVee is like, okay, ask me whatever it is that you want to ask me, right? And we don't really find out what the narrator asked him because the scene very rapidly cuts to the narrator saying, I haven't been able to speak about my experience with Mr. Richards / Mr. DeVee for over 10 years, and now this is the first time that I'm able to talk about it. What? Now, okay. I'm going to say a few things, and I'm sorry if I feel like I was all over the place, because this is like one of the most insane stories that you'll ever read. So if we take the narrator, right, his basis is that he is an occult student. He's a student of the occult, right? And his whole purpose is to study the occult and be under people that like know about it and things like that. There's different theologies that work within the realm at least during this time period. There was, men like Aleister Crowley and the Golden Order and things like that. So they were really studying within the occult. There's also some pieces that within the story that allude to the narrator actually being a part of one of these orders. So that's why he was able to say like, hey, I know who you are. Like, I know what the deal is, and things like that. I also think it's interesting that Sir Lytton, the guy who wrote this story, didn't give anybody names. He barely gave people's names. It was Mr. J, Mr. DeVee, Mr. Richards, the narrator, the narrator's friend. It was never a name because it wants you to believe, or at least the impression that I get from the story, and which is why I like it so much, is that these could be people that you know. These could be friends that you have. These experiences could be with anybody, right? Which I think is like really, really amazing. I also think it's like really cool that they talk about like manifestation and like having the ability to manifest how you feel about things, to be able to control it and keep yourself alive throughout time. I also think that it's really interesting that the concept of like understanding how your fear is working and how your fear can feed into an issue. Which for me, when I first read the short story, I was like, wow, if you really feed into fear, it's gonna make fear worse, as opposed to taking a second and taking a deep breath, being like, okay, yes, what I'm seeing is horrible, but this isn't happening to me, and it's gonna make the situation worse if I let my emotions become accelerated or become more fearful of whatever it is. I definitely recommend reading this book if you want to like dip your toe into, I don't know what I'm picking at, sorry guys. I definitely recommend you guys reading this short story, this book, if you want to get like dip your toe into like occult reading. It's really, really good. There's a few books that are out there that I'm happy to talk about, or like a few kind of like occult mythology books that are well known within the mythology. If you guys want me to talk about it, let me know. I don't think anybody needed a crystal because it was just me rambling about a short story, but if you did, leave your comments below and let me know what crystal you used today to keep yourself safe. And leave your comments if you want me to do another lore behind, or if you want me to talk about another occult story, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.